welcome everybody. This is episode 1 for the Door podcast. My name is Dirk Weiss, joined by Donovan Santamaria in the eastern time zone of Ohio. I am here in Iowa, and we decided to start up a podcast to cover life, politics, culture, everything in between, and yeah, we want to have fun conversations, and even if you don't agree with us, to at least get to a place where you can ask yourself good questions about the things that we're talking about. So I figured as we get into this first episode, Donovan, if you have anything else to add, but we can kind of get into like why we titled this podcast what we did.
Yeah, I'll get into that. The only thing I think we need to point out the obvious, we talked about this a little bit before we got going, is how white I look compared to you, even though I'm supposed to be the Mexican guy. But, dude, I spent all summer inside, never got out. So that's it, Dirk, holding down the Middle East representation here. Really appreciate it.
Someone once did tell me that I look like Steph Curry, so if you're watching, then you can kind of be the judge yourself. Yeah,
I think you'd more just look like Curry.
Yeah.
Just straight up Curry.
I look more like Curry than Steph Curry. I think that's more of a objective fact.
That's right. Wow, I would never have gotten that, but
it was some middle-aged lady in Cedar Falls was at the coffee shop and said, you kind of look like Steph Curry. And I said,
wow, she thinks they all look alike.
All men.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyone not as bright white as me. So yeah, Dirk, excited to do this with you. And I actually learned something today. I've been referencing this Doors of Perception. So we're calling the podcast The Doors, or The Door. And, that is derived, we're going to get into exactly why we call it that. We're basically saying there's one door, the door. But it comes from this idea of the doors of perception. And even as I talked with you in the last couple weeks, I had attributed it to Aldous Huxley, who many people know wrote the book Brave New World. He also wrote a book called The Doors of Perception. And I thought that quote came from him, but as I was looking today, I realized he was actually referencing someone else. And that man's name is William Blake. Now, William Blake was alive from 1757 to 1827. So 18th century, he was a writer and a poet. And he wrote a book called The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. And now that as I was reading, I remember hearing that reference. That book, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, is actually, what he's saying in there is basically some kind of monism, where he's basically saying everything is one, all is one, evil and good, and heaven and hell, all is one, and basically equates everything. And I did not know this, that C.S. Lewis wrote The Great Divorce as a polemic against that.
Oh, okay.
So in The Great Divorce, C.S. Lewis talks about the divorce between good and evil, heaven and hell, and so it's a polemic against the marriage of heaven and hell. So,
interesting.
Side note there. Yeah. So, but in that book, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, William Blake has a quote that says, "If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite." Let me say that again. If the doors, and there's the reference, the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. And then he goes on to expound a little bit, and he says, "For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through narrow chinks of his cavern." So he's basically saying that, we lack the ability to see reality in its fullness, and that we see through our narrow perspective. Mm-hmm. And Aldous Huxley pulled that quote and included it in his book that has the same title, The Doors of Perception. Now, that book is an autobiography where Aldous Huxley basically documents his experience on mescaline, taking a hallucinogenic and then writing about it. And then he includes that quote. And so what he's arguing for, at least in that part of the book, is that this mescaline helped him break through in terms of perception and see things and understand things that he hadn't seen or perceived before.
Mm-hmm.
And so he appropriates that quote and says, when the doors of perception are cleansed, we will see things as they truly are, infinite. And another side note, the band The Doors, 70s psychedelic rock band, borrowed that concept and named themselves The Doors. They were obviously big into drugs and mescaline and all that. So now the question is, you and me as Christians and, involved in ministry to different degrees at different times in our lives, like, why in the heck would we have a podcast and name it The Door and reference the doors of perception, mescaline, drug use, William Blake, who obviously was heretical, talking about, all blends into one, monism, all that. So what is the point of all this? Why would we name this The Door? And so I want to have you chime in here in a little bit, Dirk, but I want to just bridge the chasm and talk about why it is that this title was something that we thought would be useful, helpful, and frankly, I think great and interesting. And it comes to Ephesians 1. And this is Paul in Ephesians 1 praying for the church at Ephesus. And he says this: I do not cease to give thanks for you, remembering you in my prayers. So he's praying for the church. And this is, frankly, I would say the essential prayer of Paul on behalf of the church in Ephesus, but really of all Christians. When we talk about what it is that we're going for, what we're looking for in terms of increasing in godliness, growing in our walk with Christ, our essential problem is perception. And Paul is going right to the root of that and praying for that. So he says, I remember you in my prayers. And what does he pray? He says that, I pray that the God of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of glory, so the one true God, may give you, the church, what? What does he want? He says this: the spirit of wisdom and revelation in the knowledge of him. And what is that? That's perception. He's praying that they would have perception, that the doors of perception would be opened. I pray that the Father of glory may give you the spirit of wisdom and of revelation in the knowledge of him. Now remember the original quote: when the doors of perception are cleansed, right? So when the Spirit comes and he gives us wisdom and revelation in the knowledge of him, and our doors of perception are cleansed, what happens? The original quote says, we will know life as it truly is, infinite. Paul says, having the eyes of your heart, the doors of perception, enlightened, you may know what? The hope to which he has called you. What are the riches of his glorious inheritance in the saints? Now he goes on from there and talks about the immeasurable power of God. The point is this: what he's saying is, I want your eyes, the eyes of your heart, to be opened to the infinite. Mm-hmm. So my argument here is that Jesus is the true and better mescaline. Now, if you've been around gospel-centered preaching at times, you've heard Jesus referred to as the true and better King, the true and better Father, the true and better Husband, the true and better Lamb. And what I'm saying is he's the true and better everything, even that which has been corrupted. So mescaline is a substance that, in this case, is naturally grown. And there's other, man-made substances that try to approximate this. But mescaline is a substance, along with mushrooms or LSD or things like that humans have taken, and they claim that through that experience, their consciousness is expanded. And I do not doubt that. And I have taken hallucinogenic substances in my youth, and I can attribute, or I can affirm that happens. Your consciousness is expanded in some ways. Not in the true and better way. There's some things that happened there that were true, where I had a better understanding of myself. I had a better sense of the intensity of life and the weight of life in many ways. It didn't bring me to Jesus. But there was an approximation there, which is why I think it's attractive. Like, why do people do drugs? Why do people give themselves over to these things? Because they know that they are seeing things through the narrow chinks of their cavern, and they need something to break free from that. Now they're grabbing, reaching out for the false facsimile, an approximation. But what Jesus says in John 10, he says this: I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved and go in and out and find pasture. Now, in one sense, we think, well, that door means it's something that you open and you go through and you walk in. Yeah, but that's a metaphor. Like, what does it mean to actually enter the kingdom? What does it mean to actually go to Jesus, to approach him? It means to have a change in your fundamental understanding of reality, like who he is, who we are, who the Father is, what our needs are, what he has provided. Like, that is the door. So yes, the doors of perception need cleansed, and there's one who is the door, and that's Jesus. And so our hope, my hope in this podcast is that as we approach culture, politics, theology, current events, whatever it is that we're talking about, that we are seeing these things through the grid of who Jesus is, what he has revealed to us, that he has enlightened the eyes of our hearts, not fully, but to an extent enough that we know that he is the king, that he is the door, and that we do see through a cavern. And that even, man, I just thought of this. That reminds me of Paul saying we see through a mirror dimly. So it's really interesting how this guy, William Blake, who as far as I can tell from the things he's written, isn't a follower of Jesus, does not submit to the glory of God, but he's seeing something. He's basically saying we see through a mirror dimly, and we need to have the eyes of our hearts enlightened. And so that's the backstory. That's what he came up with, the idea of calling this the door. Hopefully any of you who hear this, in the future, will go back and listen to this explanation, because we're not going to do this every week. It's just going to stand. That's what it is. It's the door. Jesus, the true and better masculine. That's it. That's the podcast. And yeah, sorry for misleading you, Dirk, as I was, referring to this being a Aldous Huxley quote. But hey, we keep learning. Wikipedia is a wonderful thing.
Sometimes.
And I just love to hear if you have any follow-up thoughts on that or reactions.
I mean, first off, I feel like it's a drawn-out version of the Michael Scott quoting Wayne Gretzky chain of events. Oh, found out someone else actually said this first. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think of like the door, more of a gateway from one realm to another. From being, say, like an example, being inside a room with 4 walls, ceiling, your furniture, the things that you've put in there, it's limited. And then the door that you go through is that to which is outside, that's illuminated by the sun, something far bigger than yourself than you can really understand. But I think that C.S. Lewis quote where I believe in, remember exactly how it goes? It's been a while, but I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen. It's not because that I see it, but because by it I see everything else. Is that right?
Yes.
Pretty close word for
I believe in Christianity in the same way I believe in the sun, not just because
I see the sun.
I see it, but by it I see everything else. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah,
yes.
So then with what, if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is infinite. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through narrow chinks in his cavern. Which that's also kind of a play on Plato's The Cave, if you're familiar with that.
Mm-hmm.
Which is, it's kind of the grounding for classic philosophy. So before modernism and postmodernism, you had more the classic philosophy of like Socrates, Aristotle, Plato. And Plato has that illustration of all of humanity essentially being in chains in this cave facing a wall, and there's torches behind you, and then there's different objects or other people walking behind, and all you see are shadows. So your perception is really just formed by what you see on that wall. And then I think with the illustration, it goes further where like you actually break out of those chains and make your way out of the cave, and then you see the world. You see a far bigger reality than you had thought. And so then that's where like C.S. Lewis comes in with that quote of the sun illuminating all things, and kind of plays again off of what Plato was saying. So, yeah.
I mean, realistically, this is kind of a fundamental issue when it comes to all philosophy and religion, and we could go on forever about this, but this is kind of like the dividing line between modernism, postmodernism, and what I would call the true philosophy, which is, Christianity, which is, modernism asserts, well, man can truly know things because of scientific method and reason. And the postmodernists come back and say, well, you don't really, you're limited by your perception. And they're absolutely right. Now, what they do is they go way too far and say, therefore, nothing can be known. Well, we're limited, so everyone just has their own perception. And ultimately, it gets to Nietzsche, which is, well, then everything is just a quest for power. Your claims to truth are just a quest for power, and nothing can really be known, and all is absurd. It devolves into absurdism and all that. And so what's the way out of that? I mean, they're right that we are limited in our perceptions. So I guess we just give up. Well, no. The answer is the God, the Father of glory, who exists beyond humans' limitations, enters, invades the universe, the human heart, human perception, and gives true knowledge, right? So Christianity, in its true form, shatters both modernism by saying, you don't actually know everything, man. Your reason is flawed. You cannot achieve truth through your own reason and scientific method. And you, postmodernists, are also shattered because you cannot, or you are right that you are limited in your perception, but you underestimate my power to conquer these limits. So this is profound stuff, man. I freaking love it. This is, again, to me, the essential parts of epistemology of, the Bible, of philosophy. If you read Francis Schaeffer, his trilogy, it's all about this. And there were things that I needed when I first became a Christian, and just because I wanted to understand, hey, I didn't just believe in a fairy tale, right? And like now, 20 some years later in my Christian walk, I believe that I do believe in a fairy tale, but it's the true fairy tale, and it's the rock solid philosophy that is presented in the truth of who Christ is. So it's the door. So hopefully we'll be faithful to what is revealed. And, we're not perfect. We aren't perfect in our perceptions. We pray that the Lord will help us as we sort through culture and politics and current events and things like that, and try to bring the perspective of the Christian to these issues. And one of the things I think that will be a common theme will be that there will be tensions as we assess issues. And one of the great challenges in our time is polarization. And there is truth. And one thing that I feel like I've learned and grown in my understanding of is that a big part of the challenge to us, and when we examine current events, is that polarization is a result of not giving due respect to the tensions that are involved or exist in these issues. So we're going to tackle one today. And we hope to bring an episode to you every couple weeks and stay current with things that are happening, things that are interesting. And so today, for the remainder of the episode, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about basically this tension. So again, we talked about tensions between populism and not necessarily corporatism, but power, the elites, I would say. And sometimes it is corporate power. And I think, sometimes populism is posed as an opposing force against corporatism, which is true. But I would say it's a bigger issue, which is just powers, elites that have the power of corporations, of law, organizations, money, banks, and things like that. And so to help us along in this conversation, we have a clip from a man named Eric Weinstein. And if you don't know who he is, he's one of my favorite guys to listen to. Now, he's not a Christian. And I listened to he used to have a podcast called The Portal. Wow, just hit me. The Portal. And his brother and his brother's wife, Brett Weinstein and Heather Hine, have a podcast called Dark Knight, which Dark
Horse.
Is that what it's called? No, sorry, Dark Horse.
Yeah.
The Dark Horse podcast, which I also really like. And these guys are just very thoughtful. Now, they're both leftists in the sense they're not like hyper progressive leftists, but they're left of me for sure. And traditional Democrats. And Brett Weinstein he's just a profound thinker. Now, again, like anyone, I don't agree with anyone on everything, but he's a really compelling thinker. And you can look him up on, Google him, Wikipedia him. But right now, he basically functions as a financial executive. He's, in cahoots with guys like Peter Thiel. Thiel Capital is who he works for. Probably what he's best known for in the internet world is he coined the term the intellectual dark web. Now, Dirk, I'm assuming you're familiar with that term.
Yep.
How would you? What is that? What's the intellectual dark web?
So to me, I think I remember it got a lot more notoriety, I think, when I was in college. And so essentially it was describing this group of voices all across, the political quadrant. But were, by and large, bucking against somewhat mainstream media. A lot of them, gain traction through the internet, whether through, YouTube, social media. And so, it involves quite a few people. So, kind of on the right, you'd have
Joe Rogan.
Yeah, Joe Rogan would be included in that, and a lot of people he would host on his podcast. I think back in the day, you probably would have incorporated like Ben Shapiro and the Daily Wire. Of course, they've grown a lot more. So whether you'd throw them in that camp anymore, I don't know. That's up for debate. But the Weinsteins, some of like the newer, what's his name, Sam Harris, I think would be
Sam Harris, Tim Pool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So a lot of people with vastly different political viewpoints, faith, worldviews, but kind of having this almost a united view that this somewhat populism, even though now, like, if you probably would go through a lot of them right now, a lot of their views may have changed or morphed from what they once were, but back then that was kind of the thing against this elite group. So like for Sam Harris, the elite group would probably be Christendom. For Tim Pool, it's more corporatism and things like that. So, but there is kind of a uniting factor between all of them.
Yeah, they have a sense that the institutions have been captured.
Yep.
So education, media, political power,
healthcare,
corporations, healthcare, pharma,
agriculture,
and now, what's that?
Agriculture.
Yeah. And so with the rise of the internet and the ability for people to like now actually have a voice in the conversation, you find a new power rising. So yeah, intellectual dark web. So anyway, Eric Weinstein, very interesting. He's a bit of a polymath, and that means that he kind of dig pretty deeply into a lot of different subjects. He's written a lot on physics. He's obviously works in finance, talk politics, compelling guy. So anyway, he was recently on a podcast called Modern Wisdom, and was listening to him. And the first, it just came out of the gates, the first 5 minutes. Now we're going to play this, and we're not going to necessarily, have to listen to 5 minutes straight of him talking. We're going to pause here and there and chime in whenever you want to, Dirk, and I'll ask you to also to pause. And but he's talking about this tension between the elite and what he ends up referring to as the rules-based international order, or what some people call the liberal international order. That tension between that and populism. And let's go. Whenever you're ready, Dirk, feel free to
awesome.
Cue that up.
I think I have all the political ads out of here.
There.
When we spoke at the start of the year, I said it was way too close to November to switch anybody out. Turns out that I was wrong.
Beginner's luck.
You said, what are the odds that Joe Biden has a debilitating event between now and November, including death? So he runs a 1 in 20 chance of dying in any given year or above, that I don't think you know whether he's even going to make it to November. Debilitating event could have been a debilitating public event.
I purposely left it vague, and I didn't say the other part of it, which I now feel comfortable saying, which is I don't I don't know whether Donald Trump will be allowed to become president.
What do you mean by that?
I think that there's a remarkable story, and we're in a funny game, which is, are we allowed to say what that story is? Because to say it, to analyze it, to name it, is to bring it into view. I think we don't understand why the censorship is behaving the way it is. We don't understand why it's in the shadows. We don't understand why our news is acting in a bizarre fashion. So let's just set the stage, given that that was in February. There is something that I think Mike Benz has just referred to as the rules-based international order. It's an interlocking series of agreements, tacit understandings, explicit understandings, clandestine understandings about how the most important structures keep the world free of war and keep markets open. And there has been a system in place, whether understood explicitly or behind the scenes or implicitly, it says that the purpose of the two American parties is to prune the field of populist candidates so that whatever two candidates exist in a face-off are both acceptable to that world order. So what you're trying to do from the point of view, let's take it from the point of view of, let's say, the State Department, the intelligence community, the Defense Department, and major corporations that have to do with international issues, from arms trade to, I don't know, food. They have a series of agreements that are fragile and could be overturned if a president entered the Oval Office who didn't agree with them, and the mood of the country was,
all right, I think we should pause here.
Pay taxes and
I mean, he's so compelling. I just find him compelling. I just keep playing it. Hey, this is going to be the Door podcast, and we're just going to play Eric Weinstein talking for an hour. It's like, okay, why did we tune into you? Like, so things that he brought up. Okay, first of all, when he says, he's throwing out some terms, he says populist. Mm-hmm. Okay, what does that mean? So, Dirk, from the best of your experience and understanding, how would you define that?
Yeah, so it's to the best of my abilities without looking at our show notes.
You can look at the notes, man. We put together the notes.
Yeah, so I mean, without looking at them, legitimately right now, like in this case, like a political ideology that is more of the people, less of a single or a bureaucratic mouthpiece, meaning those who have always and forever will be in government saying what is, but those of everyday people having a true and genuine voice to move, to change the system, to make wrong things right, I think would be probably in maybe the more simple terms. But yeah, emphasizing the people, and especially juxtaposing that with the elite. Those two are at odds by nature in this in these definitions. So
yeah, in a sense, it kind of runs parallel to democracy. Like, in a sense, like democracy is, in a sense, populist, right? The idea is that, well, who should be controlling and making decisions? Should it be a small number of people with collected power at the top, or should it be a large number of people at the bottom, and their wishes? So the population, the populace, the people, right? And there's a tension there.
Yeah.
So what about the rules? Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, so populism maybe isn't a very common term for, whoever might be listening to this. So usually, kind of, it'd be a synonym for anti-establishment. It's kind of the same thing. So you've heard that a little bit more in terms of podcasts or people you've listened to, but anti-establishment is the, one of the center threads of populism.
Right. So there's an assumption there that the establishment, the powers that be, are corrupted to some extent and are not operating in the interest of the populace. Okay, so that's one term, the populism. The other term was the what he called the rules-based international order, and he said the purpose of it was to keep the world free of war and to keep markets open. Okay? Now, we can get into a little bit of the details. Admittedly, I'm an amateur in this, but I know enough to be dangerous. But the idea is that there's agreements internationally, treaties. I mean, we think of things like NATO. We think of things like the World Trade Organization. We think of things, agreements like NAFTA, where at a high level, governments, powers that be, make alliances, make contracts, financial, economic contracts, and the purpose is to increase wealth, to produce goods, to generate well-being, to keep war at bay. So things like NATO, where the European nations and America basically unite in against powers like China, powers like Russia, and there's agreements there. There's cooperation there that does allow for there to be some degree of peace, some degree of productivity. So now what he's starting to get to here, and he says, I don't think Donald Trump will ever be allowed to be in office. He's saying so far that a populist candidate that is basically bent toward hearing the will of the people, whose desires are usually going to be kind of closer to home, right? I need to feed my family.
Mm-hmm.
I need to have access to abortion. I need to be able to start a union, whatever, just the things that press you. And you're not so much usually conscious of, well, what happens if Russia invades Ukraine?
Right.
What happens if Mexico stops trading with, America, the United States of America?
Our national
and
debt.
So our national debt, right? It's just, so you got this tension. So there's people at the higher level, not necessarily better, but at a broader scope, managing issues and trying to resolve, and they're not all good-willed, so don't hear me there, but I'm saying that there's some general purpose there, I think at some good level, of trying to keep order. And then there's other people, more at the mass population level, who are less concerned with that, the day-to-day. They don't think about it a lot. They're just trying to work. Or maybe they even view that, and their weaknesses, their failings as an enemy of their interests. These things are in tension. And so he's saying a populist candidate who is not necessarily prone to give over, submit to, agree with these elite agreements is a risk to the whole order. And so he says, I don't think that Trump will ever be allowed to be president, even though he was already president.
Again,
and we can touch on that a bit.
Yep.
Right. So just covering some ground there. Let's go back. I don't know, unless you have something else to add right now, Dirk?
Yeah, I mean, I was trying to remember something he said during the beginning of that about the role that the media plays in it, or censorship. Yes. Yeah. So
why is the censorship behaving the way it is?
Yeah. So I mean, if you're listening or watching, like, there's only so much we can get into with this, but I mean, you can go into some of these operations that the CIA has gone into over even the 20th century, and you can see a lot of the stuff that was happening that we can even get access to right now. So like Operation Mockingbird was the CIA working in media to essentially propagandize different things for the people to believe and to go along with in different ways. So in some ways, yeah, I can kind of fill in the blank there a little bit. Like, why is censorship there? I think there's a lot of collusion and inappropriate interactions between larger companies and government agencies that the people who dig into this, like everyday people, not saying you and I are, but everyday people who catch wind of these things and can bring some of these things to light, other people, the wider array, so whether it's on Twitter or wherever, see that and they can kind of cast that blanket over the whole thing and see like, yeah, the whole thing is corrupt. Even if there are certain people in there that may have a good nature or a good intentions with it, but they see some of these things like, man, this whole thing is corrupt. This whole thing just needs to be done over. It needs a revamp.
Right.
And so, yeah, that's where you get this growing wave, I think, especially in the last 8 years, little over 8 years of populism in the United States. I'd say a little bit further. So maybe we kind of spent a little bit of time on this. I remember, at least from like my perspective, at least like, my voting habits. So like I was my '08 was the first time I voted. I was '08 Obama. And then, yeah, because,
oh, heck no.
yeah. So I was a low info voter, but I remember with what I gathered from, his platform, I think kind of resonated when I heard Oliver Stone say it a few years ago, when Obama was running in '08, he had kind of this JFK vibe about him of bringing change. So we just went through 8 years of Bush and going through Iraq and Afghanistan. And like, hey, maybe this is a change. We're not going to be in forever wars again. And then, he gets in, there's the recession. A lot of that, is built on from previous administrations, but the forever wars continued. And so it was like, well, this wasn't real. But then in 2012, I think the emergence of, well, he had been around but Ron Paul running for president, who kind of had this more libertarian and, in a sense, populist view of why are we even in Iraq to begin with, which is really against the status quo of, well, we're bringing democracy into a country that is struggling and has a dictator, in which, I mean, we were alive at that time. I remember the news was very much broadcasting that, like, it's wicked Saddam Hussein, Osama bin Laden. We need to get rid of them. We need to bring democracy. And, Afghanistan has been a total failure now in 2024. We can look back and see that. Iraq has its own issues. ISIS was there. So all that to say, there's just a lot of momentum that has been churning and building, I think, since, what I can remember, my college days and through the 2010s and now in the 2020s, of a growing number in the population that is rejecting this establishment, rules-based international order of things, that different social media platforms don't like, different political leaders don't like, and want to crack down on censorship and stopping these people from speaking out and talking about these things. So, including, Kamala Harris has, talked about those things being posted around on Twitter. And
Kamala.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Kamala.
Racist.
Yeah, sorry. But anyways, yeah, kind of.
So, yeah, absolutely. So let's burn it all down. Let's get back to the clip and keep going from here.
Yep. These structures, why are we hamstrung? Why aren't we a free people? So what the two parties would do is that they would run primaries. You'd have populist candidates, and you'd pre-commit the populist candidates to support the candidates who won the primaries. As long as that took place and you had two candidates that were both acceptable to the international order, that is, that they aren't going to rethink NAFTA or NATO or what have you, we called that democracy. And so democracy was the illusion of choice, what's called magician's choice, where the choice is not actually, pick a card, any card, but somehow the magician makes sure that the card that you pick is the one that he knows. In that situation, you have magician's choice in the primaries, and then you'd have the duopoly field two candidates, either of which was acceptable, and you could actually afford to hold an election. And the populace would vote, and that way the international order wasn't put at risk.
Hold on, pause that, Dirk. That's freaking crazy. I mean, there's just
Let me rewind that a little bit.
this is refreshing to me. I mean, I don't know. Like, first of all, the illusion of choice.
Ugh.
He just said you could actually afford. This might take 2 episodes, bro. Like, there's so much in my notes. Like, he said you could actually afford to have an election.
Ugh.
You can actually afford, because as long as both candidates are agreeable to the rules-based international order and won't rethink things like NAFTA and NATO, okay, we can afford to have an election.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. What would make an election unaffordable? If there was a real choice. That's what he calls a magician's choice. I mean, dude, this is why I love this guy. Like, this is cutting through, like, left versus right. And
Yeah.
we can talk about that and why I am, generally right in more ways than I am left. And, we'll get to that, I guess, in another episode. But we got all these people fighting about, like, the left versus right. Is it going to be Obama or is it going to be, freaking, I don't even know who ran against
Romney.
Romney or whatever.
Yeah.
Like, yeah. And these people are like, yeah, sure, whatever, either one, fine.
Yep.
That's great.
I mean, this
Can
is wild. Like, this
afford
is
to have an election.
like this is recent history, where in 2016 and 2020, you had Bernie Sanders in the primary, gaining a lot of traction. It was him and Hillary in the last 2 Democratic candidates in 2016, and I forget where he was, where he pulled out in 2020. I think he was near the end too, but it was this. It's time for the Democratic, or we want the Democrats to win, and so he ends up pulling his campaign and backing Hillary Clinton, which side by side were so totally opposed. In
Crazy.
Yeah, like Bernie would be a populist on the left, and Hillary, former senator, secretary of state, neoliberal, neoconservative view of, approving the Afghan war, the Iraq war, nation building, like just complete opposite sides of things. And then, I mean, very similarly with him and Joe Biden in 2020, it's like, what is going on here? So, but then,
Yes.
and then again, you take it to this year, like just a few months ago, that Joe Biden backs out of the campaign, says, I'm not going to run anymore, puts forward Kamala, and through phone calls, all the delegates say, yes, we will vote for you because you were a combined ticket, not doing a primary, and just getting it all approved at the Democratic National Convention. No one actually voted for her as the top of the ticket.
That's freaking wild, man. That you can afford to have an election. And it just shows something that I don't know if I've really thought about, is that, like, election is risky. Okay, so we've got all these things, we've got all this momentum, we've got all these ideas, we've got these laws that we've passed, we've got these Supreme Court justices we've installed, we've got these agreements we've made with Russia or China or Iran, and now we're just going to ask the people what they want. That's freaking risky.
Mm-hmm.
What if they don't want what you want?
Mm-hmm.
I don't take a vote from my kids. I mean, the analogy, breaks down in some ways, but in many ways. But the part that holds is that the people in power are at great risk if they let others who don't hold the power make the decision. So again, tensions. That, I can't believe that didn't strike me as much the first time I heard this. Like, you can afford to have an election if it's rigged. If it's rigged, now here's the thing. There's a difference between saying the election is rigged, they cheated, Trump should have won, Hillary should have won. But that's not what he's saying. He's saying it's worse than you think. It's not that they're rigging the election, they're rigging the pre-election. Mm-hmm. And it's the magician's trick of, here's your 2 cards, pick any card. And obviously Trump, to some extent, broke that, which he'll get to. So let's get back to the clip.
Candidates, either of which was acceptable, and you could actually afford to hold an election. and the populace would vote, and that way the international order wasn't put at risk every 4 years, because you can't have alliances that are subject to the whim of the people in plebiscites. So under that structure, everything was going fine until 2016, and then the first candidate ever to not hold any position in the military nor position in government in the history of the Republic to enter the Oval Office, Donald Trump, broke through the primary structure. So then there was a full court press. Okay, we only have one candidate that's acceptable to the international order. Donald Trump will be under constant pressure that he's a loser, he's a wild man, he's an idiot, and he's under the control of the Russians. And then he was going to be a 20-1 underdog, and then he wins. And there was no precedent for this. They learned their lesson. You cannot afford to have candidates who are not acceptable to the international order and continue to have these alliances. This is an unsolved problem. So I don't have a particular dog in this fight. I believe in democracy.
That's probably where we should pause. The plebiscites. Had to look that up. The plebiscites. The direct vote of the members of an electorate. So basically direct democracy on an important public question such as a change in the Constitution. So you cannot have these agreements, alliances subject to the whims of the plebiscites.
Yep.
Okay. And in this, the first time I heard this, I was like, oh, wow, he's really touching on this idea of the corruption of the system keeping out the populists. And I was like, yeah, man, that sucks. And when his last sentence here, right before we paused, which he says, this is an unsolved problem, to me gets to what we're the tension of what we're talking about here. What's the unsolved problem? He's saying both things have value. He's saying there's a value in what in a democracy or representative republic, there's a value in the will of the people. And he's saying, and there's a value in these agreements that have been established that maintain, keep war at bay and keep markets open. And there's a risk of when there's an election and someone comes in who doesn't have a built-in affinity, doesn't have a pre-approved set of agreements and alliances, that they may upset this order, and that cannot be allowed. And that's why he says at the very beginning, I don't know if Donald Trump will be allowed to be president. We'll see. He got in once. Let me ask you this, Dirk. For those who support Donald Trump, what do you think they want him to do? At the best, right? We can go to the worst, just the worst. There's a spectrum. The best, people that you think are reasonable and care for the country. Mm-hmm. What do they want Trump to do?
Yeah, I think they want him to end the wars, primarily the conflicts in Ukraine and Israel. For one, to not have death when it's present and needlessly in a lot of ways, but also the amount of funding that we are supplying to Ukraine and then both sides of the war in Israel, while at the same time we're seeing suffering here in our own country. They want him to fix the border, fix the immigration that has kind of fallen apart in the last several years. I mean, there's always been issues, but especially in the last this current term, which would be hand in hand with taking care of the fentanyl issue, then dealing with the personal economy. And there's overlap with all three of those, but I'd say those would be the top three. I think there would be, further down the list, those of like, they see him as a bastion against wokeism, against DEI policies, against big government, even though he's more of a moderate than a conservative, but they still see him as the appropriate response. Kind of, similarly to what he was in 2016, that people were seeing more of this discrepancy between this larger order and the everyday people that, in many ways seem to be suffering. They saw him essentially as a Molotov cocktail to throw into that system to say, we're not doing this anymore. And some of that was in response to Obama and his policies, and they wanted an equivalent, and if not more, stronger response to that. I think, COVID aside, he would have been reelected in 2020, but now here we are in this current situation. But I think, in short, like that those would be the kind of the short list of what they want him to be in this response.
Yeah, it's a pretty good comprehensive answer. Let's take one. Let's take Ukraine. What would you like to see happen there?
Asking me or asking for the United?
I'm asking you.
Okay. Without a lot of foreign policy background.
Well, we started a podcast about this, so we gotta do our best.
We are officially experts, and here we go. So, yeah,
we're the plebiscites.
Yeah. So I think as the war is right now, there needs to be essentially an agreement come to by Zelensky and Putin. I think eventually it's going to turn into Putin keeping the Donbass and the other eastern regions of Ukraine that are more sympathetic towards Russia or Soviet, history. And that's been a thing for a while. I think that was going to be the case. So it's going to end up with those territories being part of Russia going forward. I think in some way there needs to be some stability brought back so that Ukraine can still be the breadbasket of Europe. There's a lot of farmland that supplies the world with a lot of food, and if that's in disarray, which it has been for the last couple of years, the world feels it in some way, shape, or form by lack of food or by prices of food. I don't think Ukraine should enter NATO. That's been a lot of the issue to begin with, is NATO expanding further and further towards Russia, which, you can get into the history back in the 90s. I think it was Clinton. They said, or Clinton or H.W. Bush. One of them had said, there was like I think a verbal agreement that, that NATO was not going to go any further east towards Russia. And since that time, slowly, country by country has joined NATO, and now there are a couple bordering countries with Russia that are now NATO, which NATO, quick history lesson, was really formed against the Soviet Union, since fell, and now it's the Russian Federation, to essentially keep a check and balance between two global powers. So if you think of it in a way, like NATO is made up of different countries, but is really reinforced by the United States. For the longest time, the United States was the chief investor in this agreement of countries. I think when Trump was first elected, he essentially forced other countries to pay more of their fair share of the budget. So, as far as the Ukraine conflict as a whole, there's going to have to be a settlement. Russia's going to keep those territories. Ukraine's going to have to rebuild. There's going to have to be a lot of money pumped back to rebuild. How's that going to get paid for? I don't know. But there's no real way of winning the conflict for either side.
What?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's either going to further escalate into, a nuclear type war, not like warheads, but nuclear artillery and on smaller scale, which can definitely escalate further. But it's either going to escalate, or there has to be some sort of consolation where Russia does keep some of those territories, and Ukraine essentially just has to deal with it. Which is
So what are the cons? What are the cons of this resolution?
the cons. If you think from maybe like a cynical point of view, the NATO countries don't get to destabilize Russia through this conflict, which I definitely think is an angle of drawing all their military financial assets into this conflict, which it's drawn, you could say, almost more of ours. But I think partially used to wreck their economy, wreck their way of life, and that hasn't been the case. Makes the United States look like fools. I think very similarly with the Afghanistan pullout, it makes the United States look very weak and unstable in what they're able to do worldwide. And I don't think they want to give up another sign of that so close to the Afghanistan withdrawal in 2021. Or, yes, 2021.
Yeah, that's good stuff there. Some of that I hadn't thought of. One thing I would add is that it rewards Russia for aggression, prompted or not. Like, okay, well, we don't really want to escalate. We fear escalation, therefore we're gonna hold back. We're gonna
right. It's similar.
It's a loss to some extent.
Yeah. Even if it is a truce where, all right, we're not going to kill each other anymore, there's still one side that looks like more of a victor than the other. So, like the U.S. and Vietnam War, like there was kind of, they signed off like, hey, we're not going to fight anymore. But you know what? The Saigon embassy was still overrun, and we had to escape via helicopters. And communist Vietnam definitely looked like the victor.
So, for the sake of time, let me, I've got some notes here on pros and cons of NAFTA, pros and cons of NATO, and we've touched on NATO, so let me just kind of fly through a little bit of that. And some of this touches on what you're saying. So we've got these alliances, we've got these, rules-based international order. NATO is one of those alliances, agreements, and there's pros to it. NATO helps to defend. This is from Wikipedia. NATO helps to defend its members' territory and can also prevent and manage crises and stabilize post-conflict situations. So obviously, if there's an agreement or there's alliances, if it's just one country versus Russia versus the entire European continent and America, that obviously the pro there is that it keeps the power of Russia or whoever else it may be at bay.
Yes. Yep.
So there's a sense of peace and stability, and that's the point. Okay, but there's cons, and this is where we get into there's tensions about all this. Like you mentioned earlier about the expansion of NATO. Should NATO expand? Does Russia? How does Russia respond to the entire Western, coalition rising up in unison against them? Like, is it met by resistance? Does it make them feel cornered and make them want to strike out? The other thing is, here's another con, is that it really puts us in a place where us being the United States or any country that enters NATO now loses its sovereignty. And that's one thing I hear conservatives talk about a lot is, national sovereignty. Okay, well, but under this agreement, if Russia invades Ukraine or an actual NATO country like Finland, then we are committed to go to war. Now, back in 1945, 1950, maybe that was really obvious. It seems less obvious now. Dirk, do you feel compelled? I mean, your son is how old? 4?
3.5.
3.5. I'm almost there. Round up to 4. So fast forward, he's 18. Russia invades Finland. Do you want to send him off to war?
Absolutely not.
Probably not.
Nope.
It's harder to see now. Now maybe we should. Maybe there is some value there. Maybe NATO should stand and that's it. It's but it's just not as easy to see that the connected interests. So the point is that these alliances, so anytime you make an agreement with someone, there's pros and cons. The pros are the benefits, the cons are, well, now you are paying a price for that. They're only doing that because there's a price that you bring to the table. If there was no cost to you, they wouldn't need you. There's a cost to you, which is what? Your money and your lives. So now you and me and our children in the future, because of NATO, have an agreement, a responsibility to send money, and perhaps at some point, and there have been U.S. troops involved in Ukraine and even Israel in different degrees, if these things keep escalating, to go and have a presence there and suffer loss. Now, you may argue that you think that's worth it. Some will argue that it's not. The point is that there's a tension here, right? Is NATO a good thing? Is populism a good thing? Is the World Trade Organization a good thing? And what I would say is that we have to realize that anything that we establish here on Earth has pros, has cons, and we need to be aware of those. And what Brett Weinstein is pointing out is that a populist candidate risks the international order. And the international order has value. Now we can say, well, the CIA sucks, FBI sucks. Okay, so are we saying abolish the FBI? Are we saying abolish the CIA? Like, is that literally what we want Trump to do? Come into office and dismantle the CIA, dismantle the FBI? Like, dude, I am anti-establishment for sure. But the more I think about this, the more I feel like I'm kind of above my pay grade.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't know it's what he said. It's an unsolved problem.
Yep.
Do we dismantle the whole thing? Just become, I've listened to Dave Smith, Part of the Problem podcast, hyper libertarian, and I listen to him. I'm like, yeah, man, like, yeah, too much government. And it's like, okay, dismantle the government. And what do you think is going to happen?
Yeah. I've listened through plenty of that, like whether you're, libertarian or anarchist kind of viewpoint of politics. It's not, in some ways, yes, people just want to get rid of the 3-letter agencies. And I know, like, there's people in those agencies that are well-intentioned and are doing great jobs. It comes into those, maybe an equivalent to like a university professor that has tenure. It's like they've been there forever. They are kind of able to do what they want, kind of get away with what they want, and it's just a part of this constant system, so bureaucratic in a way. They're not elected, and they just always have this position. And if there is some way to eliminate that kind of system, I think that would satiate the populist while still trying to harmonize with, we do need some order. Like, there is value in this specific agency. ATF, maybe not, but like FBI and CIA, like I get ATF is kind of the weird one. But because usually with every administration, they have different heads of, or directors, or an assistant deputy directors of those agencies, but there are still those that are not elected or nominated, that have just been there for a really long time. Or maybe they've been nominated many, many years ago, but, there's some sort of thumb on the scale to keep them in that role for some time.
Yeah. So we have a lot of stuff in our, notes and things that we thought we'd cover, but for the sake of time and to try to like bring this, I think, to some sort of resolution, I would say that I think I'm just growing more aware of the tensions between these things. This idea of the Pax Romana or the Pax Americana, where, was the Roman Empire a godly thing? No, but it allowed for a certain stability and exchange of travel, goods, people, language that's led to the spread of the gospel. Is the Pax Americana, the modern version of the Pax Romana, a good thing where it's a global empire? Like, well, that's, forever wars and all its corruption? No, but there's pros to it. I'm an immigrant. I came here. My family came here. We're glad to be here. I don't want to live in Mexico, frankly, man. So there's this like tension and unsolvable problem, right? And so what's the way forward then as Christians? And I think that it is an unsolvable, where Brett Weinstein said it's an unsolved problem. I would say it's an unsolvable problem. So it doesn't mean don't vote, and it doesn't mean we shouldn't at some point trend more towards populism or more towards hierarchy and control. But I mean, I think we have to be aware of the pros and cons and risks of tearing down a system that provides some amount of security. There's a kind of a bit of a naivete on some people that think, well, if we just get rid of Americanist warmongering, then we'll all just be at peace. Like, well, no, and then China will warmonger. Like, we live in a fallen world where there will be warmongers. And so, again, this is where the Christian perspective comes in. Like, we're not naive. Like, there will be warmongers. And the government is here to punish evil and reward good. Will it do it perfectly? No. But we cannot be all for one or all for the other. I do not wholly subscribe to some blind patriotism where I think America is beautiful and great and holy and Christian, and I do not also subscribe to some idea where America is completely evil and needs to be abolished. Like, if America was abolished today, I'd be terrified.
Oh yeah.
Frankly.
Yeah.
And I think there's some horrible things it's done. So
yes.
The idea is that we need, well, frankly, we can talk about these things, consider these things, and go vote. We'll maybe do a podcast on that, how Christians should view their vote. But generally, I would say get involved, pray, discern, do what you think is best. But the reality is any system can be corrupted. So here's a quote from, I think it was James Madison, who said, or John Adams said, our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. So he's saying the Constitution, because it gives a lot of power in its purest form to the populace, it needs a moral and religious people. Because if you give the vote to the people, they better have some discernment. You want to pull up that other clip I sent you real quick?
Yes.
Just a few more minutes on this. So if we're asking people to vote, they better have discernment. They better have wisdom. They better be godly, right? So go ahead and roll.
Because democracy basically means government by the people, of the people, for the people. But the people are retarded.
I mean, his timing is impeccable. That is the most patient man on the planet.
Yes.
Now, he's saying the people are retarded, like whether that's true or not. But the point is, maybe they are.
Oh.
Like, if you want the people to vote, well, they better have some degree of wisdom or discernment. But it's not just democracy. So whatever system you put in place to exercise power. So if you got a rules-based international order, well, those people better have some discernment. Those people better have some wisdom. Mm-hmm. They better have a moral base. If you establish a king, he better have some wisdom, discernment, a moral base. Like, every human system is subject to the extent to which those people are aligned with God and his love, kindness, wisdom, fruit of the Spirit. So is democracy good? depends on who's voting. Is monarchy good? Well, depends on who's the king, right? So our hope is not. Let me back up and sum this all up. I think that we've established that there's tensions between the populace and the powers, the elites that be. Having just the population just have what it wants all the time, it will be good sometimes and horrible sometimes. Having the powers that be establish their order will be good sometimes and horrible sometimes. So is it just all empty and worthless? And what's our hope? Like, where do we go from here? I mean, I'm basically just deconstructing the whole thing and saying it's all a mess. So what do we do, Dirk?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, be active, pray. I think the one thing to not do, in video game language, is to be an NPC, a non-player character. You're just doing the same day-to-day functions every day without a personality. Like a character in a video game that is not someone you can play is like, this guy walking down the sidewalk. The sidewalk is just a computer-generated person just walking.
Are you explaining that to me because I'm old and you think I don't know what that means, or is this for our audience?
Let's just say it for someone listening.
Okay. I know what an NPC is.
Yeah, don't be an NPC.
Because I'm not one.
Right. And I mean, that's a meme too, where like NPCs are like that crowd of like gray people with pointed noses, and it's like all saying the same thing in a text bubble.
Right.
To not just go with a group's voice just because you watched enough videos of it on YouTube. It's constantly asking questions, discerning through that, and having that understanding with yourself that it's okay to have nuance, that you don't have to be completely politically binary, whether it's like, well, I guess I'm 100% Republican then because I don't agree with the Democrats. It's, where we were watching Eric Weinstein, but his brother Brett, who, classic Kennedy Democrat, is voting for Trump this year because he's understanding nuance, and he's playing like long game, or, he talks through it, but understanding that this massive, comprehensive, complicated system that we find ourselves in life and in 2024, to have discernment, and it's not something easy to pick up. It's something that you need to grow in, and something that needs to be developed over time and with mature people who are on that same journey as well. And so, if we can be a help in that, it's great. Even if, if you're listening, you don't agree with many things we say, like, that's fine. At least if we can be helpful in getting people's eyes just off of a singular focus of policy or candidate. It's just something so much bigger than that. It's bigger than the race. And so, for us, we have like a gospel lens on this, where it's like, yeah, it's over all of creation. It's a massive story that we are a small part of, and there's lots of doors of perception that people think there are, but we believe that there's one door. And this tension that we feel in this conversation with populism and establishment and any other topic that has a kind of tension, to know that it finds its harmony in Jesus. Like, Jesus is that perfect blend of empathy for the people and to hear and to listen, but he also has the authority that is safe and true and good.
Yeah. So vote, think, perceive, discern, pray, but spread the gospel, because no matter the system, it's dependent on godliness. I'd take a king if he was godly. I mean, just remember the Old Testament, God established monarchies. Mm-hmm. And when the kings were godly, the place was fruitful. and when they weren't, it wasn't. So we'll do another episode and talk about the value of democracy and whether or not that's biblical or whatever. But the point is this: every system has its limits, and it's limited by the weaknesses and sin of its participants. So back to the door, the Word of God. Paul says this in Romans 8, the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. So no one that we're voting for, the creation is not groaning for the election in November. It's not groaning for that. The election will come and go, and the creation will continue groaning. And what is it longing for? The revealing of the sons of God. And what is that? That's when the end comes and Jesus comes back and he ushers in the new creation. We can have some gains here. Okay, we can accomplish, the abolition of slavery. Lord willing, we can accomplish the abolition of abortion. There have been gains here, but heaven is not here. So the creation groans, and we ourselves groan, and the Spirit groans within us. For what? The revealing of the sons of God. And who is that? Those are people that are in line with the heart of God. And in that era, then the king will reign. There will be no vote, and there will be no need to vote, because the people will be aligned with the power. And there's the dissolution of the tension. Right now, there's a tension between the people and the power, because we have different goals, different priorities, different values. But the kingdom of heaven is when the ruler, Christ, is in line with his people. They now love what he loves. They like what he likes. They see what he sees. And the tension is now resolved. And this whole idea of populism versus the elite is gone, because the populace, who's us, join the elite and become elite with him. So anyway, I'm starting to preach now. But the idea, though, I think you get the main point, that we are to engage here. And we're to have what I would call a mitigated optimism, like good can be done. We are not without hope here. Christ can accomplish great things, and we're called to take part in that and discern and be gracious and seek wisdom. But our hope is not here. And I really think that's a big part of the issue, is that we just put our hopes here. And so it's going to be either this candidate or that candidate, or it's all going to go to hell in a handbasket. It's like, well, no. We hope in Christ. So, got some more stuff here. Probably a little long for that, but I think we've come to a good place. I don't know, Dirk, any final parting thoughts? Or?
Yeah, I think it kicks it off well. I think, we'll try to get another episode out before the election. We can talk about Trump working at McDonald's for the afternoon. That was today.
I actually worked at McDonald's. So there. And I did fries.
Longer than Trump. He worked there longer than Kamala.
That's right. It was my first job, and then I got fired, and I'll tell you about that later.
Very good. Yeah.
I'm always getting fired. What the heck? Oh, man. Jeez. My son just laughed. I can't even keep a job at McDonald's.
I think it's a good place to kind of land the plane. So be on the lookout. We'll have more content coming out here very soon. So if you have some ideas and topics you want us to cover, reach out and suggest. And we'd love to look it over and see what we can do. So we got a lot of material, I think, clearly based off of just this one conversation. So we'll see how deep the rabbit hole goes. Until next time.
Absolutely.
See you later.
All right. Thanks, Dirk. See you guys.